Over my career, I've done a lot of interviews with some well-known people and some people no one's heard about before. I thought it might be fun to drag some of them out of the archives and share them here on YouTube. And how would you like to have the last name Karloff? Well, the great Boris Karloff had but one child, Sara Karloff. Now in her later years living in Southern California, I asked Sara about that last name and whether there were others in the family.
Actually, I'm the only legal Karloff, because my father never took the name legally. He retained his real name, which was William Henry Pratt, and Boris Karloff was only a stage name. On my birth certificate, my name is Sarah Jane Karloff Pratt. So I guess that makes me the only legal Karloff.
Absolutely. I often wondered, and I never got the chance to interview him, whether Roy Rogers changed his name from Leonard Sly, which is not a very pretty name, to Roy Rogers.
However, Leonard Sly wouldn't be a bad professional name either.
Not anymore. No, it wouldn't. How old were you when you first realized that, other than being your dad, that Boris Karloff, everyone knew who he was?
It was sort of an evolutionary process. My father didn't bring his work home, and he didn't talk about his work. He didn't talk about other actors. He unfortunately wasn't a collector, and so too bad he didn't collect movie posters. Wouldn't we all have enjoyed that now, with them selling at these outrageous prices? But his friends were friends that were as often not even in the business, and a lot of them who were in the business were behind the cameras, not in front of the cameras. So my parents' friends were just my parents' friends. In Beverly Hills, a famous, quote-unquote, famous last name was not unusual. Mm-hmm. And to a youngster, a famous name is not famous. It's just a last name. So it was really when we went out in public and people would point or stare. Riding in an elevator with my father was always an interesting experience. People didn't know whether or not to mind their manners or to take advantage of a captive situation. By and large, they minded their manners, but the body language going on in the elevator was always interesting to watch. And then if one turned around quickly when we left the elevator, you could see people pointing and saying, "Oh, there's Boris Karloff. That was Boris Karloff, you know." But in the elevator, it was still interesting to watch what was going on surreptitiously.
You talk about the fact that Hollywood names were common if you grew up in Beverly Hills. I remember seeing an interview with Debbie Reynolds, who was talking about how she was a den mother and the Dale Evans used to drive the kids to scouts and everything. And these were just mom and dads. They just happened to be famous.
That's really true. I mean, I remember stopping at, my father had a convertible, and I remember stopping at stoplights with him. Or one time he took me to a football game, and I can assure you people rose around us, didn't know a thing that was going on at the football game. Those sorts of things brought his fame into personal focus, but otherwise, it just wasn't part of his life. He didn't live as if he were a famous movie star. He was very modest, very self-effacing, very quiet, and he, his hobbies were reading, gardening, animals, and certainly he was passionate about the British game of cricket. None of those are the things you would attribute either to a movie star or to a monster.
That's right. I always think that those Hollywood stars who had a, quote, normal, unquote, lifestyle were really to be honored. I remember hearing stories about Robert Preston, who was married a long time. He and his wife seldom went out. They didn't immerse themselves in the Hollywood culture. He got active in, I don't know which suburb he lived in, but with the local Kiwanis Club and things like that. And it sounds as if your dad was just happy to be a dad.
Well, he was happy. He was thrilled to be able to spend his life in a profession that he adored, and then be jolly well paid for it.
Yes.
His proudest work, I think, however, was the time he spent as a founding member of the Screen Actors Guild. His card was number 9.
Wow.
And but he never spoke about that. He was on the board of directors for years and years and years after the founding of it in 1933. At that time, that was very dangerous work, and they were putting their careers on the line, forming this union of actors against the studio bosses and directors. And I remember my mother telling me that they would park their cars blocks away from one another's homes and walk to meetings, and when they went to parties, couples would dance by one another on the dance floor and say, "Meeting Tuesday night at so-and-so's house," and then dance on by. So
this would make a good movie in itself, know?
It would. But, those actors felt so strongly that it was important to speak out in support of those actors who had not yet reached a point in their profession to have a voice. And those actors who were the founding members had worked unimaginably hard and unimaginably long hours under horrendous conditions. And they felt they had an opportunity to change that for up-and-coming actors. When my father made Frankenstein, he was a contract player. He wasn't even invited to the premiere of Frankenstein. It was his 81st film, and no one had seen the first 80. I mean, he'd been around in Hollywood at that point.
He had been paying his dues long time before suddenly, overnight, he's a star.
After 20 years in the business, he was an overnight star. So that was the work he was the most proud of, I think. But quietly, he never talked about it. So those public appearances that he made were to either for charity or to publicize a film at the direction of the studio.
Is it possible to explain to people today how much, I hate to use the word slavery here, but the studio system, which did all it could through its publicity departments to make the stars look happy and well-adjusted and fun, and if a star weren't dating or they thought that he didn't like women, they would pair him up with some gorgeous woman and have Life magazine photograph it. But you didn't have a life. I remember Cesar Romero telling me that the studio system both made his career and destroyed his personal life.
Well, actors during the time that my father came along were treated like a piece of meat. I mean, and that's what they were to the studios. They were totally dispensable. And the studios ran their lives both on and off the set.
And then you take somebody such as Louis B. Mayer, who I only discovered through documentaries and interviews, wanted everyone at MGM to think of him as a father figure. They were his children. But he was worse than a disciplinarian, and he would dismiss you like that if you said the wrong thing to him. It must have been a horrible way to make a living.
They were tyrannical. And it was a very brave thing, those first members of the Guild. It was very brave.
Do you remember who some of the other founding members were?
Frank Morgan, Lucille and Jimmy Gleason.
Did you know Jimmy Gleason?
Oh, very well.
I saw him on This Is Your Life, and I want to talk about your dad's appearance on Ralph Edwards' program. I thought Jimmy Gleason was one of the most genuinely nice people. I think he lost a son in the war and then invited all of these young kids over to his swimming pool and everything. And I cry very easily. I started crying just watching his life story.
His daughter-in-law was my godmother. My godmother, Cynthia Lindsay, was married to Russell Gleason, and Jimmy and Lucille were my parents' closest friends.
Did you know Gene Hersholt?
Well, know him. I certainly knew him as a friend of my parents.
He was an actor, I guess, I being an old-time radio fanatic, best remembered for playing Dr. Christian on radio, which was an interesting show because they actually invited listeners to write the scripts.
Oh, really? I wasn't
Yes,
aware
they would
of
send
that.
those in. They had to be cleaned up, of course. By cleaned up, I mean made presentable. But Hersholt was one of the driving forces behind what became the Hollywood Home and Hospital out in Calabasas, realizing that there were a lot of technicians, cameramen, whatever, who never made big bucks, and when they retired, they deserved a place to which to go.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's still operating, isn't it?
Yes, I was out there just a couple of months ago. It's just a lovely, phenomenal place to go in a beautiful setting out there. So in growing up, did you go to high school in Hollywood?
No, my parents were divorced when I was 7. And each remarried very happily and successfully, and for the rest of their lives, actually.
Mm-hmm. At what ages, then, did you live where?
I lived in Beverly Hills until I was 7, and then when my mother remarried, she married an attorney from San Francisco, and I moved to San Francisco.
That's not a bad place to grow up.
I loved the city, and I was blessed by having a wonderful stepfather on whom I thought the sun rose and set.
Carol Channing once said there are only 2 places you need to grow up, San Francisco and heaven.
That's right.
I've never lived there. I lived 2 hours away for 6 years, and I got over there every chance I could. And now I see the street people and the dirt and the problems and the traffic, but it just recharges my batteries.
Now they're trying to decide whether or not to outlaw or revoke a law that allows you to dine naked in public. The city's changed since I grew up there.
It certainly has. I heard about that. Let's not get into that. Sara, I want to talk about so many things with you, including the work you've done and your private life and everything. But we mentioned This Is Your Life. And for those who are too young to know, it was the grandfather of all the reality, all the Let's Surprise People shows. I went to Truth or Consequences, New Mexico with Ralph Edwards one time, and I was like a little boy meeting Babe Ruth. I mean, I just idolized. But to think that in the days of live radio and television, not only did this show have to come off on time, but the honored guest had to be there. And I'm sure Ralph Edwards had a lot of ulcers, but there's one show in which they honored your father, and I guess Ralph had invited your dad to come see the show for 3 or 4 weeks in order to get him comfortable. And at one point, he points the camera over, and your dad and I guess mother are there, and or his wife at the time, and the producer Axel Gruenberg, and Ralph said, well, let's show some of our friends over here. And he walks over to your dad and says, oh, by the way, Boris, this is your life. And he turned out to be this gentle, with beautiful British accent man, and I think that probably surprised a lot of people.
Well, Ralph and Barbara Edwards were very, very good friends of my father's and stepmother's, and very often Evie and my dad would meet Barbara and Ralph for dinner after the show. And in those days, the show would be, it was done by live kinescope, and so people who saw the show and about whom the show was taped, would then go upstairs and have dinner and watch the show on a screen as it was telecast live across the nation. And so it was always a lovely, fun evening. And so very often my father and Evie would participate in the dinner and watching it upstairs. And they would watch from the wings, the show downstairs. So it was not unusual that my father and Evie would be downstairs in the wings watching it. So that but my father had elicited almost a bloodletting promise from Ralph that he would never make him the subject of one of the programs.
But crafty Ralph broke that promise.
Evie talked Ralph into doing it.
Ah.
And later on, my father said that Evie sold him out for a washer and dryer.
I love that line.
My father was horrified. He did a triple take on my stepmother when he realized he was the subject. And my father was a very private man, very private. And I can imagine what was going through his mind as to what they had, if you'll pardon the pun, unearthed. He was, oh my goodness.
But it was a lovely show.
Oh, it was a lovely show, and Ralph did a beautiful job, and the people he selected meant so much to my father. I mean, the Jeffrey Taylor that was his old school chum, my father just could not get over his being there. The cricketer meant so much to my father. Jack Pierce, my father was had always considered the best in the business as a makeup artist and a sheer genius. And Frank Brink from Anchorage, Alaska, where my father had gone up and done Arsenic and Old Lace to raise funds for the building of a theater up there. These people were wonderful, wonderful people for Ralph to have selected for that program. So it meant so much to my father that to see these people. So the show was very meaningful, but that particular night, if one watches that show, was the night after they went upstairs and they watched it. My father was taken to the hospital and diagnosed with emphysema, and that is ultimately what he died from in 1969.
So that was a rather bittersweet day.
It was indeed.
Yes, absolutely. I remember one This Is Your Life where they are profiling a woman who was a survivor of the Holocaust. And at the end, they talk about how her dream now, and this was 15 years later, was to be able to go to Israel and see her brother, whom she hadn't seen since before World War II. And Ralph starts out and he said, now, Prell Shampoo has made it possible for us to, and she thinks they're going to say, fly you to Israel. And he says, bring your brother here. And he walks out, and it's just every TV show, Oprah, whatever you see today, where they bring in people, those shows owe everything to Ralph Edwards.
Yes, yeah, they really do. He did some remarkable things with that show. He really did. He was a lovely man. I knew him very well.
Let us talk about your dad's career. Born in England, in the suburb of London.
Correct, Dulwich.
And then spent the early part of his acting, if I'm not mistaken, in Canada.
First of all, he was trained and educated for the consular service, as were all his brothers. They all served in the consular service. One was knighted for his service in China, and my father always referred to him as my brother the Sir. But when my father finished his formal education, which was an excellent education in England, he decided it was not for him to go into the consular service. And he literally ran away from home and got on a ship and headed for British Columbia. He actually flipped a coin between Australia and British Columbia. It shows you how much he knew about the theater. And British Columbia won, and he wanted to be an actor. He got a job, however, on a farm because there were no jobs.
This would have been about what
1919.
Ah.
And so my father auditioned with a repertory theater group presenting himself as a experienced British actor. And he told the story on himself that when the curtain went up on his first performance, his salary was $30 a week, and when the curtain came down on his first performance, his salary was $15 a week, because it was abundantly clear he'd never set foot on a stage before in his life, because the plays he said he had been in, he had only seen in London.
But a great self-promoter.
Oh, you bet. And a quick study. And he actually performed and worked with 3 different repertory theater groups over a period of 10 years, sometimes building sets, sometimes painting sets, sometimes performing, sometimes doing 3 to 5 plays a week. You had to be a quick study. Sometimes getting paid.
And this was before cue cards. I mean,
we're
yes. Talking about real legitimate theater.
Really learning. And it was wonderful training. And sometimes getting paid, sometimes not. Sometimes digging ditches, sometimes driving a truck. He worked for the British Electric Company, the British Railway Company, doing anything to sustain himself.
Isn't it funny how, unless you research the life of a Hollywood star, you assume that they were always at the pinnacle. And we talked about how he labored in the vineyards, if you will, for decades and then was an overnight sensation. And so many of them are like that. They were bellhops or waiters or whatever. But people seldom look back that far. How did he make the transition then from British Columbia to Los Angeles?
Well, he just made his way down to Hollywood, where they were making films.
And this was the silent era.
Yes, this was the silent era. And he performed in silent films in ethnic roles, primarily because of his dark coloring. And he finally got a role in a play, The Criminal Code, with Howard Hawks, and then was cast in the film, which was a big break for him. But as he said, he he was an extra in Hollywood for years, being the 3rd from the left in the 4th row, and finally got some bit parts, and just hung on, again, doing any odd job that came along between roles, and then he literally was in the commissary on the lot when James Whale spotted him. Bela Lugosi had turned down the role of the Frankenstein monster because he did not want to wear all that makeup and all that wardrobe and do a non-speaking role. And so James Whale asked if he would test for the part. And so my father was sent over to makeup, and Jack Pearson, he worked for 2 weeks on the makeup. My father removed a partial dental plate to create the indentation in the monster's cheek, and he made some suggestions for the eyes so that they looked a little more dead. But everything else was Jack's genius. And the rest then became cinema history.
How old was your dad when Frankenstein was made?
44.
44.
And
how tall was he?
He was 5'11", but and the plaster boots were only about 2 inches, only elevated his height by about 2 inches. The rest was camera angle.
I was going to say James Whale did a magnificent job of making your dad look as if he was towering over people.
That's right. It was camera angle, and it was the posture of my father, and it was a perfect marriage of James Whale's brilliant direction, the genius of Jack Pierce's makeup, and the empathy with which my father, and pathos with which my father played that role. And it was just everybody was at the right place at the right time.
I think if you had to take all the Hollywood roles of actors or actresses with little, if any, speaking parts, that has to be right up there, because the emotion that your dad showed the audience with just his eyes
and his hands.
His hands. I never thought about. I have to watch
his
them
hands.
next time.
If you look at his hands on the statue that I have out in the front of my house, and in many roles, but especially in the Frankenstein role, his hands, as he reaches for the light, his hands depict so much emotion in so many of the roles he played.
I'll have to look for that. Now, was he immediately given another role after? Did his rise to fame, was it so quick that everybody wanted him then?
Well, then he did become an overnight star.
After working for 20
years.
20 plus
he
years.
Became an overnight star, and as I say, it was his 81st film, and no one had seen the first 80.
Mm-hmm.
He did become an overnight star, and he then became known by his last name, Karloff.
You'll see that in the credits.
Yes.
Yes.
And thereafter, he made The Bride in 35, and The Son in 38 and 39. But he did, I can't remember how many films, just back to back to back.
I asked Sara Karloff if her dad ever minded the fact that he was by and large typecast.
He was always asked if he minded being typecast, and he really, the difference that role made in his life, it was a pivotal difference, both professionally and personally, and he truly was grateful to that role and the difference it made in his life. And he often, with a bit tongue-in-cheek, referred to the creature as his best friend in interviews. But
especially when he headed to the bank.
Yeah. Well, no, he wasn't that well paid for that film.
But it made his career.
It certainly jump-started his career and kept it going. However, whenever he was asked that question, he said, doesn't everybody want to establish a trademark, no matter what their profession, to be known for what they do, and to have their name, if you happen to be an actor, to have your name or your face come to mind when a casting director is casting a part or in a film. He said, if you can make yourself a niche in your profession, you're very, very lucky. And no matter what that profession is, if you can establish a trademark, what more could you want?
I saw an interview with Arthur Treacher one time, and it may have been him talking to Merv Griffin, because when Griffin had his TV talk show, Arthur Treacher, of all people, was his announcer for a lot of years. And he was talking about how he was always a butler or a British policeman. And Merv or whoever asked him if that bothered him, and he said, no, that's what I'll be remembered for. So I understand that, yeah.
And yet my father had did a huge body of radio work, just an enormous amount of radio work. He did 20-some children's albums. He did a large amount of Broadway. He was nominated for a Tony. He won a Grammy for How the Grinch Stole Christmas. He was a guest on every prominent TV show of the day. He had 3 TV series of his own. I mean, he had a very, very broad career. But he owns Christmas with the Grinch, and he owns Halloween with his horror-based career. So how lucky could he be?
Absolutely. His voice was such a magnificent, comforting kind of thing. A deep, rich baritone voice. I can't even do it, but yet he spoke, and it had a twinkle. You could almost see his eyes twinkle when he was reading that. There's another thing, and I would love to find a copy of this. Back in the early, would be mid-late 60s, there was at that time an Air Force half-hour show that radio stations played. There was recruiting, and they would have Hollywood stars. They wrote an original Christmas story called, I think, Timmy Discovers Christmas, which predated The Grinch. And I have a scratchy old copy of it. I would love to find the original because it's one of the most delightful things in his narration. And I used to play it at home in the summer, and I played the record to death. And now I wish I had made a copy of it. So you're right, he did some magnificent voice work.
He did indeed. And you know, he could do anything with his eyes, he could do anything with his voice. He could make it melodious and soothing, or he could make it menacing and terrifying. He could do anything with his voice.
Sarah, you talked about those two holidays. What demands are put on you at Halloween? You must be asked to speak everywhere.
Well, my father always said Halloween was his busy season, and it has become mine. This past Halloween, I was fortunate enough to speak at the Lincoln Center Library and at the Museum of the Moving Image, both in New York. Every Halloween, I am invited as a guest at an enormous science fiction horror genre show in New Jersey, where they have about 15,000 plus attendees.
Wow.
And October in general is my busiest appearance month. So it's a fun time for me because I get to travel places I normally wouldn't get to. And I get to meet my father's fans, which I thoroughly enjoy doing. And they share with me the loveliest stories, and I get to spend 3 days having people say nothing but nice things to me.
That's an enviable kind of thing.
It is indeed.
Are there young fans?
Oh, it's amazing. It's multi-generational in its appeal. Grandparents saw the film, or great-grandparents. They saw the film originally, and then their youngsters or their children saw it on television, and then their children saw it on DVDs, and they're introducing their kids now. So I have generations of families bring their kids to these shows or these appearances that I do, and the youngsters now know the dialogue of these films verbatim. It's amazing.
Let's talk for a moment about the movie Frankenstein, 1931?
Correct.
You watch it now, and of course, movies have progressed, not necessarily for the good, so far. Here's a movie with very, except for the elaborate makeup, very simple effects, very stark sets, which at the time, I would think, it's hard for us today, is what I guess I'm trying to say, to understand the impact as a horror movie that movie had to the audience at the time.
Well, it was a frontier-breaking film. I mean, black and white films are far more suspenseful. The shadows, the anticipation of what is to come next. Those kinds of films invite the participation of the audience's imagination, and they don't dump everything in the audience's lap. It perhaps takes a more intelligent audience than today's audience, who is accustomed to having it all laid out in their lap, and today's films are more to my way of thinking, repulsive and revolting rather than frightening, or they're not suspenseful. They just show you everything. There is nothing left to the imagination, or there's nothing left unsaid, or it requires nothing of the audience
It's
except
numbing.
to keep their eyes open.
Well, I remember in college, I was very lucky. I went to a very good broadcast school at Indiana University. The first thing they did was to have us get rid of our Hoosier hillbilly accents. But the professor played a lot of old-time radio drama, which when I was 18, I thought, what is this? Now I listen to it all the time. But he said, the monsters on radio were much worse than the monsters on television, or even now with the computer-generated images they have. Because, as you're saying, it was the theater of the mind.
That's
you can
right.
always imagine things worse than they are.
Oh, absolutely. And I speak to a lot of school classes from junior high through, I've spoken to colleges and every year to a high school here in the Valley. And one of the questions I ask them is what would they think of colorizing these films? And to a student, they say no, which is amazing because this will have been one of a very few black and white films they've ever seen, ever.
Trying to figure out how many years ago Frankenstein was.
80th anniversary.
I was thinking 70, but it's
80th
past the 80th.
anniversary. It was released 80 years ago.
Aren't we so lucky that, and they haven't preserved all of them, I mean, a great deal of those silent nitrate films fell apart. I think they say they can only find something awful, such as 48% of all the movies ever made. That not only do we have that, not only can we look at your dad, but you can.
Yes.
Yeah. What is that like?
In some roles, I think, what a horrible film. One of the worst kept secrets is I don't like scary movies.
Oh, you better say that again.
I really don't like scary movies. I leave the room during Murder, She Wrote.
Okay.
When the music builds, I'm out in the hall or under the sheets. So I have not seen all of his films by a long shot. He made over 170 films, which is a huge body of work. Some of them are lost. Some of the serials he did early on are lost. But I have a marvelous friend, Ron Borst, who is a collector and a film historian, and he lives in the Los Angeles area. And he came out here and sat down with me in broad daylight with the lights on and helped me watch The Black Cat. And it took 3 increments during the day, holding my hand tightly to get me to watch The Black Cat. And he said, "You can do it, Sarah. I know you can."
I have missed probably some of the great classic horror scenes because I've had my hands over my
Indeed.
face. I just really have never been able to get into science fiction for some
Oh,
reason.
no, but horror film, the whole genre. So, it's very bad casting me as my father's daughter.
Well, that surprised me.
It's just...
You don't even look evil.
Thank you.
You're
Well,
welcome.
my father wasn't evil either. He was the antithesis of the roles he played, so...
I think that, well, of course, I had heard him in the Air Force show and as the Grinch and some of the narrations and seen him in a few other things. But even though he was upset with his wife on This Is Your Life, I just sat there and watched the repeat. The Ralph Edwards people re-released many of those older shows. And I'm thinking, what a sweet man he was.
Oh, he was. He was a lovely human being with a wonderful sense of humor and a marvelous listener and just a sense of fairness.
There must have been a great reaction in Hollywood when his death was announced.
Worldwide.
Hmm.
It was amazing. Worldwide. And this past Halloween, Mayor Bloomberg of New York declared it Boris Karloff weekend in New York.
Neat.
Yeah.
I like that. Couple more quick questions. We may have touched on it already, but what is the most common question kids ask you?
What was it like having Frankenstein or being the daughter of a monster?
Have you written a book?
No, there's a wonderful new biography out written by a British author, Stephen Jacobs. It's called Boris Karloff, More Than a Monster. And Stephen spent up to nearly 10 years doing his research. It is the definitive biography. And the research is impeccable. I learned something new on almost every page about my father, about the family, about his career. No one need ever pick up pen again to try to write a biography on my father. And there have been many written and several very good ones, including the one by my godmother, dear Boris, which was a wonderful Valentine to my father. She said everyone, almost to a person that she interviewed about my father, prefaced their remarks by saying, "Oh, dear Boris." So she titled the book that. But Stephen's book, this new biography, is a work of love and art and research, and it is superb.
I would presume he tapped your brain for that. Or was there much contact?
Lots of contact, but my brain was hollow compared to the research he did.
Wow. We've talked about your dad. Let's talk about you.
Oh, my.
Charity work?
Some.
Things you'd like to talk about?
I really don't like to talk about me. What I do run is a business called Karloff Enterprises, and the purpose of that is to make certain that when people want to use my father's name and likeness in advertising or on products, that they do so tastefully and appropriately, and to oversee and protect the legacy he left both personally and professionally.
I don't know whether you ever met Larry Harmon, who was the television bozo the clown. He became a friend of Stan Laurel in his later years, and Disney wanted to buy the rights to the Laurel and Hardy characters, but Stan sold those rights to Larry Harmon, and he told me that he said, "You won't believe what some people have tried to do with the Laurel and Hardy characters." And he said, "I've got to protect Stan. I love that man, and I don't want to see them engaged in this or talking about that." And I can understand that. It's more than just a copyright issue. It's to your heart.
Oh, it is indeed. Certainly, it is. There's a law in several states that protects the rights of the families of deceased celebrities and their persona rights. And people come to me for a license for the right to use my father's persona, both in and out of makeup. And I operate on the theory that it has to work for the licensee or it won't work at all. But I want the use to be tasteful and appropriate.
Were your dad alive, he would be about how old?
Oh my, he'd be 124.
Probably looking a little bit like Frankenstein.
Indeed. He would be absolutely amazed at the longevity and enormity of his legacy and his fame, and that he has become iconic. He would just be amazed.
Sara Karloff, I'll tell you what, let's get up and walk over here to the front door. You mentioned that there's a statue of your dad outside. I saw it coming in, and we're walking through the door to this lovely little courtyard. This is the most amazing bronze statue, Frankenstein with the elevated shoes. Where did this come from?
A marvelous artist named Mike Hill made this. And I want you to notice the angle at which the body stands. It's magnificent. He caught my father just perfectly from a side view. And the angle of the arms and the hands, we were talking about the hands earlier, he captured my father's likeness perfectly in makeup. And it's just a wonderful piece of work.
You had talked about him acting with his hands earlier. I'm looking at his right hand. There's so much uncertainty and terror and strength and timidity all tied up in one piece in this.
There is. It's a beautiful piece of work.
This has been a great hour. I want to thank you for inviting me into your home here and taking the time to talk about your memories.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, and I would invite people to visit our website, which is www.karloff.com.
All right. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for going back into the archives with me. I'm Dennis Daly. See you next time, right here on YouTube.